In a rich suburb in Cleveland, Ohio, Mr. Parmenter, his wife, and a 10-year-old girl were sitting around the radio. Away from them, far in New York, Mrs. Anna Farrell and her nephew were doing the same. So were John and Estelle Pauls, a couple living in a different part of New York City. Just like today with our podcasts and our lo-fi playlists, people around the country were doing the dishes, studying, and putting their kids to bed while listening to the radio in the background. It was a quiet Sunday evening on October 30th, 1938. It was 5 p.m. on the West Coast, 8 p.m. in the East. Suddenly, the music stops on the radio, followed by a strange interruption. Ladies and gentlemen,
we interrupt our program of dance music to bring you a special bulletin from the Intercontinental Radio News.
Mr. Parmenter from Ohio was the first to take notice. He remembered there being a special, program at this hour, but never a news bulletin of this kind. In their apartment in New York, Anna Farrell and her nephew stopped what they were doing to listen on. At 8:50 p.m., a huge flaming object, believed to be a meteorite, fell on a farm in the neighborhood of Grover's Mill, New Jersey. The breaking news mentioned that a reporter by the name of Carl Phillips and a certain Professor Richard Pearson were driving to the impact site as they speak. Naturally feeling nervous, Mrs. Anna Farrell had now involved her sister to listen with her. Somewhere in Oregon, a tuberculosis patient named Lucille McLean had invited all the other patients in the ward and said, "Quick, listen, Mars is exploding." Almost 1,000 miles away in Los Angeles, Mrs. Johanna Wilesinski made it her duty to call up all her friends and family to listen to the current news happening on the radio. But none were as freaked out as John and Estelle Pauls, the couple I mentioned at the beginning of this video, who were driven out of their apartments when they heard this news. They lived in a working class neighborhood with exactly $6 to their name, and they listened in panic to bulletin after bulletin that described about some type of armed invasion that was happening at the eastern seaboard. In the radio, they listened live as the 22nd Field Artillery opened fire at these invaders, but the invaders released a cloud of poisonous black smoke, and the listeners were shocked when they heard soldiers choking to death live on air. Warning: poisonous black smoke pouring in from Jersey marshes, gas masks useless. Urge population to move into open spaces, smoke now spreading over Raymond Boulevard. The Paulses, as you may have guessed, were freaking the fuck out. Estelle Pauls had a family in Raymond Boulevard, for God's sake. She thought that her sister and her kids were all dead from toxic fumes at this point. She cried and urged to her husband to leave and help her sister, and both John and Estelle Pauls left with their $6 and rushed out the door. They found a man on the street to whom they warned about the invasion, and the man set off running, obviously. They went to the train station and boarded a ticket to Hartford, Connecticut, which cost them exactly $6, the only money they had left. Inside the train, the Paulses warned the other passengers, mostly college students, about the invasion that was happening in Newark, New Jersey. Word of invasion spread like wildfire inside the train, with everyone shouting over one another, trying to find the closest radio to listen to this broadcast. Soon, one passenger said something to John that Estelle couldn't hear. "What?" she said. She asked her husband, fearing that the worst has happened to her sister. John went silent for a bit. Then he turned to her and said, "Honey, yes? Who the fuck is Orson Welles?"
Orson Welles had shaken the country without knowing it was possible.
A mythical invasion by monsters from the planet Mars should have had so profound an effect upon radio listeners. We are deeply shocked and deeply regretful about the results of last night's broadcast.
The War of the Worlds broadcast was one of the most controversial pieces of media that panicked over 1 million people across the United States. I have been meaning to make a video on this for the longest time, and I actually bought a teleprompter for this occasion that I don't know how to fit into this camera. And there's a dog barking in the background, but ignore that. But I figured, hey, I worked on this video for over 2 months. The script is fantastic, so let me just wing it, and I'm pretty sure you're gonna like it. This show was hosted by Orson Welles on CBS, and it caused so much uproar that government officials, thousands of angry letters, the FCC, and even Hitler himself had to address it. Yup. How could this happen? How could a radio adaptation of a classic science fiction novel convince so many people that they believed it to be true? Because like I said, John and Estelle Paul spent their remaining $6 to flee hundreds of miles away, and it's because of those college students that they met who loaned them the money that they were able to make it back home. And there were many people like that, not just them. And even though it's mostly forgotten today, this broadcast has been referenced in so many movies and TV shows like The Simpsons, Family Guy, and even the Batman and Superman comics referenced it.
Martians, you do know that radio broadcast was a hoax.
It even changed the trajectory of Orson Welles' entire career. For better or for worse, we'll find out soon enough, so stick around. But mostly, this type of hysteria is not an isolated incident. Time and time again, it's been proven that something like the War of the Worlds panic is possible, even today. So what caused this mass panic? And how could we spot the warning signs should it happen again? But before we get into all of that, we have to look at how this broadcast came to be. So let's look at briefly how this program started. It all started when John Houseman, a young and ambitious producer, was looking for young talent, and when he happened to walk into the Martin Beck Theater in 1934 to watch Romeo and Juliet, a boyish face yet powerful voice caught his attention and he fell in love. Houseman later recalled that he fixated on this young actor with, quote, an almost romantic infatuation. That young actor was 19-year-old Orson Welles. Welles was working with the Cornell Company at the time and was kind of getting sick of it, and 3 weeks later, Houseman approached Welles with an offer for a role in a play called Panic. Fitting. Orson jumped at the opportunity, and this was the start of a long friendship between Welles and Houseman. Houseman also set up a portion of Panic to air on the radio program The March of Time. Back in the day, The March of Time was a very popular news broadcast, and they were known to break some of the most important news right when they happened, like the Lindbergh baby kidnapping, the Hindenburg explosion, you name it. At the time, it wasn't known by the listeners that they sometimes recreated explosions like the Hindenburg one in the studio to give the listeners a feeling like they were actually there. That kind of embellishment of real news was unheard of during radio's infancy, so no one really cared, to be honest. Anyway, the March of Time signaled the start of Welles' radio career, since after the broadcast of Panic, CBS gave Welles a 9-week series offer to adapt literary classics for their listeners. Orson loved this idea because this would give him a chance to impersonate so many real people and fictional characters, so he and Houseman set up a company called the Mercury Theater. But Welles and the Mercury Theater had a staunch competitor, the Chase and Sanborn Hour. This program steamrolled every other radio program with the ratings, and Welles's artsy-fartsy show became CBS's afterthought. But this gave Welles's program an air of highbrow entertainment. It made it seem like it was for a niche audience, whereas the Chase and Sanborn Hour were for the non-readers, Welles's listeners love to read literature. Welles's listeners saw themselves with the same air of superiority, as we will soon find out. Anyway, with a fraction of listeners than the Chase and Sanborn Hour, and adapting beloved literary classics like Dracula, Count of Monte Cristo, A Tale of Two Cities, no one, not Houseman, not Welles, or CBS themselves were prepared for what's to come when the Mercury Theater decided to adapt The War of the Worlds by H.G. Wells. The War of the Worlds almost didn't happen on air because Welles didn't like the story very much. He thought it was too science fiction-y and cartoonish for radio. So he left this adaptation in the hands of Houseman and went to work on his play, Danton's Death. This was the time when Orson discovered filmmaking and was starting to lose interest in radio. Houseman then hired a young and aspiring writer named Howard Koch, yes, that Howard Koch, and asked him to adapt War of the Worlds for radio and make it more believable. Houseman hired Koch mainly because he came cheap, and the radio show was not making as much money as Houseman wanted. So Koch went to work, and he was given 6 days to finish the job. But after hitting a writer's block, Koch went for a casual drive, passing by small towns until he stopped at a gas station and bought a map. He closed his eyes and dropped his pencil on a random point on the map, and where it landed was Grover's Mill, New Jersey. Coach had an idea. He realized that in order to make the story set in Britain sound more believable, he had to change up all the names to, you guessed it, American names, believable, official-sounding American organizations, and set up the invasion right here on the little old town of Grover's Mill, New Jersey, aka Ground Zero for the invasion. He finished the script on time and sent it to Houseman, and Wells later said that it was the corniest shit he had ever read. I'm not joking, he literally said that. In fact, he threw the script on the floor and called it, quote, the worst piece of crap I've ever had to do. So Wells finally took charge. He made changes to the script that inevitably led to the story being so believable that the next day he would be apologizing to an entire nation on the front page. First things first, Wells made changes to the pacing. He drastically slowed the pacing at the beginning and gradually sped it up to create more tension around the Martian invasion. Second, he removed the mid-break. This is important. The mid-break came 2/3 after the show, not the first half, and many historians today believe that this was one of the major contributors to the panic. As we all know, you can't rewind radio, so the listeners who tuned in late didn't get the memo that this was all fake, and when they panicked and ran out the door or, picked up their phones, the mid-break came much later, and the damage was already done. But what was happening during the broadcast? Let's take a peek inside the studio as the live show was happening, along with outside the station where panic began to erupt. So much so that the police had to break down the studio doors. So the changes were made, and Orson downed an entire bottle of pineapple juice and put on his headphones. The music was playing, as usual, the highbrow classical music, and some of the regular listeners of the Mercury Theater, like Mr. Parmenter, Anna Farrell, John and Estelle Pauls, whom we all mentioned at the beginning of the video, were all waiting for the program to start. But even Mr. Parmenter, along with other regular listeners, had to do a double take when the program started with an interruption, like a breaking news segment. The interruption oddly didn't begin with an attack on Earth, but an explosion on the planet Mars. It said that astronomers at Chicago and Princeton noticed some explosions on the planet Mars, and people who were convinced that this was a real news bulletin that kind of didn't give a shit about explosions in Mars. I mean, who cares, right? But the real problem began when the reporter Carl Phillips and Professor Richard Pearson started talking about a meteor that had crash landed on Earth and landed on Grover's Mill, New Jersey. Of course, there was no Carl Phillips and Professor Richard Pearson. These were actors, and there was no meteor that had landed on Grover's Mill. But this was the time when a lot of late listeners tuned in, and even some of the regular listeners of the Wells program were confused about this realistic sounding live news report. But the biggest problem, or according to theories, the audience that panicked the most were possibly listeners from the Chase and Sanborn hour who got bored and were perhaps channel surfing and landed upon this strange news broadcast. They had no idea about the nature of Wells's show and didn't realize that this was a radio play. Anyway, Professor Pearson, aka the voice of Orson Welles, said that he had just received a message from Phillips about an earthquake-like intensity hitting just outside Princeton. Phillips was now on the site explaining how this thing, as he describes in real time, had fallen from the sky and plowed into a farmer's field and was cylindrical and made of a bizarre yellowish white metal. Listeners could hear the wailing sirens of police cars as Phillips complained that a cop was now blocking his view. But what he said next made people shit their pants. Phillips described that the object was opening and a tentacle-like creature was crawling out of it, large as a bear and skin like wet leather as he described it. The eyes were black like a serpent, and late listeners couldn't make heads or tails of what kind of Lovecraftian demon this reporter was describing. His mic was capturing all sorts of police sirens, the thud of the machine opening, and people yelling thanks to the wonderful sound design of the Mercury Theater. Suddenly, shit hit the fan, or rather, flames hit the fan. Listeners heard a weapon being fired onto the crowd, and Phillips screamed screaming in horror. "There's a jet of flame springing from that mirror," he yells. "It strikes them head on. Lord, they're turning into flame." Amidst his screams and other people yelling, the sound suddenly cut off, and then silence. Wells took a pause like a master, but those few seconds were enough to set panic in motion. Mrs. Anna Farrell, whom we mentioned before, ran out with her sister in her pajamas and warned cab drivers, local bars, and get this, even considered buying poison so she doesn't die from alien flames or poison gas. I mean, can you blame her? She missed the break for a few seconds when she dashed out where they announced that the broadcast was fake 2/3 into the show. So did the Pulses, as we mentioned before, and many, many others. People listened in terror inside their homes, and they later mentioned crying, having panic attacks, praying, sometimes all at once. As the Secretary of the Interior addressed the nation to be united to fight against this alien force, which were now, according to the bulletin, 6 gigantic tripods marching towards New Jersey and killing every cop and soldier in sight, people in that area were now panicking for an escape. According to letters written to Orson Welles, the FCC, and the CBS radio station, one woman was covering her face all that time so that she doesn't die from the poisonous gas that was being reported in the broadcast. Other letters talked of families packing up their cars and driving off to the hills. A lawyer mentioned seeing a car with a family piled inside, the driver white as a ghost, screaming about an alien invasion. In Philadelphia, Elvesta Flanagan heard her doorbell ringing non-stop, only to find her crying neighbors running in the hallway talking about bombing planes, martial law, destroying bridges, and Flanagan just kind of stood there confused. When she went inside and listened to the radio, the program, she immediately recognized the voice of Orson Welles and the other Mercury Theater actors because she was a regular listener of the program. She told all her neighbors, some of them already packing their bags ready to leave, and color returned to their faces. One letter mentioned that a hysterical woman came running into the church yelling about a Martian invasion while Sunday service was going on, making everyone spill out of the church running for their lives. I can't believe, I can't imagine how she must have felt on one day. I don't even know how, she showed her face after that. But people weren't just panicking in the streets. The biggest reason why this panic spread like wildfire was because people picked up their phones. Telephone switchboards lit up like a Christmas tree with over 100,000 phone calls around 9 p.m. to 10 p.m. in the New Jersey area. It wasn't just New Jersey though. Calls came from all over New York, San Francisco, and other towns came pouring in, asking if their loved ones were okay. Trenton police reported over 2,000 phone calls that night in 2 hours, which is 500% over their normal capacity. Rumors of heart attacks started spreading, so did of people arming themselves against the invasion. I mean, it was pandemonium. The second problem occurred where people were living in tight quarters. The denser the population in one area, like apartments, dorm rooms, hospitals, prisons, the panic bounced around like a virus in an echo chamber. An inmate from Michigan prison wrote to Welles about how his fellow inmates did everything from reforming to getting prepared to be released by the invaders from Mars and, quote, a more plain scared bunch of boys you never saw in your whole life, he wrote later to Welles. In a frat house in Oregon, the same fear spread while in Kansas as an entire fraternity of boys were huddled together and listened. Two boys decided to have a little fun and lit firecrackers and turned off the electricity. Mr. Welles, I am telling you, I've never seen such a scared bunch of college boys in my life, the prankster wrote to Welles. As the announcer on the radio, played by the actor Ray Collins, did his best to sound solemn and hopeless and said, "No more defenses. Our army wiped out. Our artillery, air force, everything wiped out. This is my last broadcast. The rout of civilization, the massacre of mankind." He was quoting the book by H.G. Wells, by the way. It was all that was needed to dial up the panic to 11. Cops went door to door asking everyone to evacuate. Random accounts recalled listeners piling to their cars and or having threats to commit suicide. A woman named Caroline Canton even reported of an injury where she ran down the stairs and was photographed the next day with a broken arm and skinned knees. As the voice of a single ham radio operator came on air, played by the actor Frank Reddick, who desperately yelled, "Isn't there
anyone on the air? Isn't there anyone?"
only to be met with silence. Over 1 million people were successfully panicking because of this broadcast. Oh, did I forget to mention? While this whole thing was being recorded on the inside, Orson Welles and the Mercury Theater had no idea what was going on the outside. And after the first fucking break of the show, finally, 2/3 into the broadcast, Orson Welles and the Mercury Theater were about to find out what they had just done. So after 40 minutes, Orson Welles and the other actors took a break over some coffee and discussed how to end the show. Houseman was watching from the control room when suddenly his door burst open and he found CBS executive Davidson Taylor panting and gasping, having just run out of the control room. He told Houseman that they had to stop the show at once. CBS switchboards were overwhelmed with calls from frightened listeners, he yelled. Rumors were coming from all sides of the country of people killing themselves and flying out of their homes in droves out of fear of the Martians. Taylor said that they had to announce that the broadcast was fake immediately, right now. But both of them knew that by then it was too late. But before Houseman could even respond or register what Taylor was talking about, there was another knock. This time, 2 police officers walked in, and one of them was trying to break the studio door. This was the first time Welles had any glimpse of what was happening in the outside world, and he saw the 2 police officers standing in the control room, and he still had no idea about what the hell they were doing there. But he sensed that something was definitely wrong, as later on you could hear him ending the show with his voice sounding a bit strained and stiff, and he even fumbled his words a bit, saying the best next thing instead of the next best thing.
By tomorrow night, so we did the best next thing. We annihilated the world before your very ears and utterly destroyed the CBS.
Once he ended the broadcast, though, all hell broke loose. CBS employees burst into the studio and snatched up every bit of evidence before the police or press could get their hands on it. The phones were ringing off the hook. Some were sending death threats to Welles, while another phoned in a bomb threat. God, of course. And soon after, the cops were all over the place, shoving the cast and crew into a ladies' bathroom for their own safety while they scanned the building for explosives. When they finally got out of the women's bathroom and into the real world, Welles and Houseman were swarmed by reporters asking them how they felt knowing that their broadcast perhaps killed as many people as a small war.
I simply don't know. I can't imagine. I know less about this than you do. I haven't read the papers.
Bro, reporters have no chill back in the day, even today. They repeated things like mass stampedes, traffic accidents, suicides, as if they were all factual and not hearsay. Welles and Houseman got out of the back door and into a car, and both men looked at each other, fearing that they had accidentally become mass murderers. On the other side of town, Howard Koch, the mastermind behind this mass panic, was fast asleep in his own apartment. He has no fucking clue about what just happened, and without even looking at the newspapers the next day, he went outside for his morning shave. While walking towards the barber shop, he heard chatter from passerbys about an invasion or panic, but he didn't pay much attention to it. The barber gave him a strange look as soon as he entered, and Koch was kind of confused about why he was staring at him. What? He asked. The barber simply smiled and handed him his morning papers. On the front page was Orson Welles, looking like his grandma had just died, with a transcript of the broadcast Koch had written all over the front page. Koch just stood there, the moment feeling absolutely surreal to him. He knew that his career would never be the same. The front page photo was taken just after the broadcast ended, when Welles and Houseman noticed the ticker on Times Square and stopped to see what was being written. Orson. They couldn't believe that it was their own name, the news of the panic being broadcast in like big bright letters. And Wells thought that he was going to be arrested at any moment. They went back to the theater where a crowd of press photographers were already waiting, and his photo was taken and he was labeled Public Frightener #1 on the front page. Other papers printed headlines such as Fake Radio War Stirs Terror Through US, Radio Play Terrifies Nation, and so on. CBS lawyers gave Wells a hurried statement where he apologized and claimed to be, quote, deeply shocked and deeply regretful about the results of last night's broadcast. But the nightmare was not going to stop there. Soon, lawsuits started pouring in, and housemen estimated that about $750,000 were spent on settlements. Then there was the FCC, who were hounded by the media and mostly by the public to take action against the broadcast. US senators and FCC members were soon painting the think of the children narrative, as always, arguing that plays centered around the horror genre could cause nightmares among the children. Even H.G. Wells, the author of War of the Worlds, had heard from sources about the broadcast and got so mad that he asked CBS to publicly apologize for rewriting his book for American audiences. He had just released a new novel apropos of Dolores and was afraid that people might think that this broadcast was like his own idea as a marketing tactic to like promote his new book. But his criticism kind of disappeared when the Baltimore Sun reported that all copies of War of the Worlds were sold out and borrowed from the library before noon on Halloween. Demand for the book across like all stores skyrocketed. Maybe that made him forget about the apology. I don't know, it's hard to say. But the most colorful reaction of all were the letters. Thousands of letters were sent to Wells, the FCC, news media, and CBS, and some of them had some choice words against Wells. I mean, this is the late 30s, like people weren't as brash as today, you know, but
to you, the assholes of the Earth and Mars, we, the people of Pennsylvania, think that you are a piss-pot bastard, and all the rest of the words we can't think of saying.
okay then! There were other letters saying things like,
I would not insult a female dog by calling you the son of such an animal. Your conduct was beneath the social standing of and would be unbecoming and below the moral perception of a bastard son of a fatherless whore.
Or,
if this Orson Welles ever finds himself below the Mason-Dixie line, we will string him to a tree.
I mean, it's safe to say they didn't hold back. All in all, it was not a fun time to be Orson Welles that Halloween. But why? Why was there such an overreaction to this fucking broadcast? Why did people believe such an elaborate and supernatural sounding hoax? And why was there such a vast-ranging outcry about this like one particular show? Well, two things added fuel to the fire. Let's start with the first one. For a little too long, news media enjoyed the monopoly of being the only distributor of news across the globe. That all changed with the invention of radio, but print media didn't think of this new piece of tech as competition, since all it seemed to do was play some music and reenact plays once in a while. But when the Lindbergh baby kidnapping happened, along with the Hindenburg explosion, radio journalists were on site giving detailed reports in real time, followed by sounds, sirens, and the panic in the background, sometimes recreated in the studio, making people feel like they were right there. By the time newspapers printed the stories, people were already up to date about and didn't care much about reading it 24 hours later. Sales were dwindling for the newspapers, and they didn't take this too lightly. So when War of the Worlds panic happened, they all found their new scapegoat. Every newspaper from the Washington Post to the LA Times to Boston Globe to your local newspaper wrote a front page article about the panic. They all needed a reason to heed the dangers of radio, and now they had one. Every paper talked about heart attacks, fainting, squad cars and ambulances roaring the streets, a near suicide, and other people who were prepared to fight against the alien invasion. Was there any truth to these claims? I don't know, no one does. But this type of fanning the flames caused an even bigger hysteria than the broadcast ever intended. Reporters also filled the gaps on their own, saying that most of the hysterical people were women, since in the 1930s, hysteria was usually seen as a female problem. This claim was later debunked by Princeton psychologists who found that both sexes were equally panicked by the broadcast, but this did not stop newspapers from printing outright horseshit. See, at the time, radio was like the only rival to newspapers. And after radio scooped up every juicy piece of news out there before the newspapers ever could, they were out for blood. This was nicknamed the press-radio war in the 1930s, and after the Great Depression, radio steadily kept growing while print media fell behind. So when they had the chance to print about radio causing mass panic during an already troubled time, they jumped the gun without checking most of their headlines. Most of these papers even patted themselves on the back for being the bastion of factual resource when frightened callers asked them about the invasion. Their narrative turned into a patronizing one, with the Milwaukee Journal printing things like radio is young and had not yet learned its lessons, and the Detroit Free Press calling for Mercury Theater to receive some sound spankings as rewards for their efforts. Every newspaper prided themselves as being the older and wiser medium of journalism, and tried to use this broadcast as a way to regulate radio under the hands of print media. But there was another more potent reason why this panic reached critical levels. Can you guess what it is? Let me give you a hint. Yep. This was the time when the world was anxious about another major war thanks to Adolf Hitler's rise to power. Radio interrupted regular programs on a daily basis to bring news about Germany's demands and unrest across Europe, and listeners had gotten used to these interruptions. So used to, in fact, that when War of the Worlds broadcast happened, many listeners tuned in late and actually thought that the attacks being broadcast on air was an invasion by Nazi Germany on American soil. This would be wild to imagine today, so let me give you an example. Imagine if CNN or BBC or even Fox News suddenly started broadcasting about an alien invasion from Mars. Wouldn't you take it a little bit seriously? You'd check the dates, right, to make sure that this was not an April Fool's prank. Well, that was what radio was back then. Radio was people's go-to news network, an immediate, reliable source of information that would never lie to them, right? Right? War of the Worlds brought into question the reliability of many broadcasts that aired, and a question began to rise in people's minds. Did this give the Nazis some type of idea? Would they use the power of radio to manipulate people and cause mass panic? Americans knew all too well about how Nazi Germany used radio to spread propaganda amongst its citizens. It also didn't help the situation when Hitler himself made fun of the broadcast a few days later, saying in his speech, "I have to do everything and will do everything to keep Germany so well armed and equipped that her peace can never again be threatened. That does not mean I will start a war scare in the world, a panic perhaps about an impending invasion of Martians." Yup, news about the broadcast reached Nazi Germany, and it didn't take long for them to spread it around like propaganda, led by Hitler's right-hand man, Joseph Goebbels. But the most bizarre aftermath of the War of the Worlds broadcast was an event that is often overlooked, yet its similarities to the broadcast and its timing as well cannot be overlooked. On the evening of August 31, 1939, a top-secret SS agent staged a mock attack on a radio station in Gleiwitz, Germany, just outside Poland. They pretended to seize the station while wearing Polish uniforms. This staged attack on a radio station was planned weeks earlier by Heinrich Himmler and the Gestapo. They wanted to make it seem like Poland had attacked Germany in order to justify an immediate invasion. The next day, on September 1, the Nazis invaded Poland, with Hitler claiming that the Polish troops had attacked Germany. 2 days later, Britain and France declared war on Germany, and World War II had officially begun. And it all started with a radio hoax. I'm back! If you've been watching the video, of course, I was still here, but I had to take a few weeks off, which turned into 2 months. You can see from my long hair, the lack of design, and maybe a little bit of weight loss. I hope. But while researching for this video, I figured, you know, I know everything about this incident, but not at all about what happened to Orson Welles, the host of the show. So while researching for that part, I also stumbled upon a couple of other video ideas which I had to write down, and that took a long time. But now I want to cover what happened to Orson Welles during this broadcast and afterwards. Did his career take a dump? Did his career skyrocket? Let's find out. Throughout this chaos, Orson Welles had like this deer in the headlights expression and also had a small bout of depression, thinking that his career was over, of course, right? He remained alone for several days and even fired someone for eating a Mars bar at the Mercury Theater. Wow. I mean, he gave his public apology, his face was plastered all over the papers, and all he had to do was wait for what happened next. What happened next was a unique twist in the public narrative. With the politicians and the papers talking about like radio censorship, the audience began to feel a different kind of fear. They thought that the reaction to this broadcast could cause like a mass, like widespread radio censorship or media censorship in general, and they began to defend this program, and most importantly, Orson Welles, through the only medium they could, through mail. Thousands and thousands of letters were sent to the FCC, to the newspapers, and to the studio, more in support for the broadcast than against. Instead, a new narrative started to form on who exactly panicked during the show. One listener wrote to Welles to not humor the whims of the stupid. Listeners started to believe that a dim-witted audience that didn't even know how to read were trying to silence a program that was like too smart for them to understand. Remember the highbrow audience attitude that I was talking about right at the beginning of this video? Yup, that was swinging in full effect. This letter sums up perfectly on what the argument was brewing regarding the panic.
You can't protect a pig from wallowing and scratching his back, nor can you protect the human mental pigs who, in spite of the millions spent in education, refuse to be educated. Why not put the blame where it belongs, on the so-called comic strips such as Buck Rogers, Flash Gordon, or others, and not on the Mercury Theater?
So began the narrative that the only people that panicked during the broadcast were like people who only read comic strips or didn't understand the program, and this type of elitist attitude by these niche listeners was not the only thing that was funny. The fear of censorship actually made an unlikely alliance between the newspapers and radio. Both the mediums agreed that like this kind of censorship could affect both mediums negatively. Newspapers started vehemently defending radio against censorship. So ultimately, instead of like the government's censorship and control of broadcasting, War of the Worlds had the opposite effect. It pushed America further away from censorship as people began to fear that government's control of the media and the radio could push the country towards totalitarianism like Hitler and Nazi Germany. So the FCC had no choice but to drop the matter entirely, and they gave no judgment on what would be the fate of the broadcast and the Mercury Theater and CBS. So what happened to Orson Welles after this broadcast? And also, were the media news about like people taking up arms in Grover's Mill, New Jersey against the Martians all true, or was it all a hoax? When reporters who got the news of the meteor strike and the panic from the telephone switchboards finally reached Grover's Mill, they were quite surprised to find out that the town was like peacefully unaware of what was going on. The only events of that day in Grover's Mill, aka Coach's ground zero for the invasion, was that a poor fire chief had to go around town chasing false reports of fires set by aliens, and that he heard rumors of farmers arming themselves against the invasion, and over 100 state troopers had to come to disarm them. There was also rumors of a water tower being mistook for like the Martian tripod that was shot to hell. But no image of such like bullet-ridden water tower exists, so take that with a grain of salt. But the town wasn't completely devoid of panic. Neighboring towns like Trenton received so many phone calls that they had to send men with gas masks to investigate, only to find like thrill seekers and adventurers, not Martians, in the town. That's right, The panic soon began after the outsiders started swarming into this town after hearing about this alien invasion. Soon enough, there was a traffic jam, and local stores had to put up signs like "To the meteor" with an arrow pointing the tourists towards the alleged site so they would stop asking for directions. Sightseers parked their cars in fields, destroying crops. Local mills had to be closed early, and soon enough it was a media circus with reporters from all over the country huddling in this one spot, which eventually caused a bottleneck. But even with all this activity, there was very little for the reporters to photograph. I mean, Grover's Mill is perhaps one of the most boring places to stage an invasion. So what could these reporters do? Well, they improvised. They had to bring something to the press, so they staged many photos. Things like locals sitting and chatting about the events, a family looking up at the sky with a conflicted expression, and this iconic photo of 76-year-old William Dock, shotgun in hand, ready to fight the Martians. And this is what eventually became the poster for the panic. This image went the 1930s equivalent of viral, with newspapers running along with it and Life magazine placing it alongside famous stars from King Kong, Flash Gordon, and Boris Karloff in Frankenstein. Doc kind of resented this fame later on by saying that the media and the press had made a joke out of him, but that did not stop this image from entering into folklore status. 50 years later, this photo even came up in a DC comic, using his famous rabbit gun to shoot up a robber who was dressed as a Martian. But what about Welles? How did Welles come out of this panic? Well, the answer may not be what you were expecting. Believe it or not, Orson Welles was one of the wokest stars you could think of, and had never shied away from a controversy. His famous Voodoo Macbeth, where he hired black actors to take the stage at Harlem's Lafayette Theater, had brought a great deal of negativity and racism in the reviews, but over 10,000 people came to watch the show because no one had ever done Shakespeare like this before. He did this at 20 years of age, by the way, so making the War of the Worlds broadcast sound as realistic as possible was not out of character for him. But he didn't anticipate what would happen after the broadcast, not immediately after, but later in his career in directing and acting. People's defense for Welles helped him a great deal during the panic, and it helped him come out unscathed, and he got a little bit of popularity for a while. But the Mercury Theater was not so lucky, as it shut down due to bankruptcy as Houseman couldn't fund it anymore because Welles's plays and movies kept flopping left and right. His radio show, however, found a new sponsor, Campbell Soup, and with new money came new changes, as they wanted Orson to interview more famous celebrities and adapt more bestsellers, turning the program into a shell of its former niche style. Writer Howard Koch was the first to leave after these changes occurred, and his career actually went in a positive direction after quitting. And he went on to write movies such as Casablanca, 13th Letter, Sergeant York, and even winning an Academy before being blacklisted by Hollywood for having leftist views. But what about Houseman and Welles? What happened to these two and their friendship? Well, after the Mercury shut down, Welles worked on flop after flop, which did not go well with the head honchos of Hollywood. The two movies that he was working on died in pre-production. At the time, he was working on a script called American, about the life story of a newspaper tycoon. When Houseman once visited his house and told him to get his shit together or his company would become insolvent, his words pissed off Welles so much that he threw flaming plate heaters at him, setting fire to a curtain, and accused Houseman of stealing his money. Houseman left the city the next day and vowed to never speak to Welles again, only for Welles to apologize and bring him back to work on The American, which they later retitled Citizen Kane. Welles drew some inspiration from his infamous War of the Worlds broadcast and added it to Kane, starting the movie with a fake newsreel about the life and death of the protagonist. On Welles's 26th birthday week, Citizen Kane was released, and surprisingly, it flopped. It only gained the cult classic status it is today, but it failed to make the studios the money back at the box office. Can you guess why? It's because Welles was still unable to shake off the typecast of being the horror man, the guy who frightened an entire nation with talk of aliens, and his newfound fame, the Campbell Soup sponsor, RKO signing him up, was because they all identified him with the War of the Worlds broadcast. RKO didn't even know how to market Citizen Citizen Kane, as the audience still had a fresh idea of Orson Welles being the boy who cried Martian. Also at the time, William Randolph Hearst was a powerful newspaper tycoon, and theaters refused to play the film so as to not incur his wrath for being so similar to Kane. RKO lost $150,000 at the box office, and Orson Welles' later movie, The Magnificent Ambersons, although appreciated by viewers, met a similar fate. The Saturday Evening Post in 1940 once wrote, "The chief victim of the panic is Welles himself. He is branded for life as the Mars Man," and they were correct. The typecast stuck to Welles for so long that any other kind of play or movie that he wanted to do only resulted in a flop. So what does a man do under these circumstances? Well, he sold out. I mean, not immediately, no. I mean, he still tried one last time, but his last movie with RKO, It's All True, was such a disaster that parts of the film were sold as stock footage and other parts of the movie were dumped in the Pacific Ocean. Yup, you heard it right. Soon, investors started calling him Crazy Welles, and he often got the blame whenever his movies lost money. So after losing all of his money and basically being shunned by Hollywood, he decided to capitalize on this man from Mars fame that he never asked for. He started by lending his name to a collection of short sci-fi stories where Coach's War of the Worlds adaptation was included. He later appeared as a character in a Superman comic inspired by War of the Worlds, where his character boards a spaceship where he finds a couple of Martians trying to invade the Earth, and his warnings to Earth over radio fall on deaf ears, except Superman. Then he made a 6-part series for the BBC where he talked about his experience with the radio, dedicating the final episode solely to the War of the Worlds broadcast. It was safe to say that after trying to shake off this image, Welles milked it in his later years for all it's worth. But selling out and only being known for this fluke accident did not sit well with Welles, as was very evident. He was usually known as the boy genius, and now his best years were behind him. He would go on talk shows and interviews and still be asked about this broadcast, and he would laugh about it and make jokes with the host and claiming that he was in on the joke. He wasn't. But being known only for that silly broadcast and not as the serious actor and director of movies like Citizen Kane, it grated on his nerves. He took to drinking and eating, and in his later years, he had become almost unrecognizable to his younger self. Even film students till the 70s knew Welles for this broadcast, not as the man who made Citizen Kane. In the end, Welles ended up in his own prison of being known as the Horror Man, the Man from Mars, and all that bullshit until his death. It was only in recent years that Welles's genius was recognized for films like Citizen Kane and The Magnificent Ambersons, the former being known as it being regarded as the greatest film of all time. But all Welles ever wanted was to create the kind of splash and press for his movies that unfortunately accidentally happened because of the broadcast, a kind of fame that he could never ever replicate. This video idea actually started at my own incredulity at this event. I couldn't believe that this was possible. But with events like the Y2K panic and apparently the world-ending event of 2012, and even more recent events like the goofy marching into Area 51, or even something as serious as the January 6th riots, I realized that mass hysteria will always be a part of our society. But that's not what surprised me. What surprised me was my own anxiety in making this video, because remember I said that I took a month off, actually 2 months off, to make the rest of this video, partially because of the research I wanted to do for Orson Welles, but also because I was scared. I started this channel with video essays on my favorite TV shows, and those didn't get that much love. And I get it, I was a new YouTuber back then and my skills were still rusty, and then I moved on to making movie reactions, which I really loved, and still I will keep making those things. But I remember the love and the work that I put into those video essays, and oh man, those were the times. And I'm really grateful for all the audience experience that I gathered from making those movie reactions. And I have like so much love in making those. I learned about so many movies making those. So like I will keep making them, but I have a special kind of love in making these types of videos. And I want to know right now from you guys. I would love to make even more detailed documentaries on famous and infamous events in Hollywood history at least twice a month and place them, while making my movie reactions. So my movie reactions would be weekly, but these type of detailed documentaries will be bi-monthly, of course, for the editing and the research that goes into these videos. So if this type of video actually interests you, please boost this video in the algorithm by giving it a like, comment down below your thoughts, you share it with other people, and that way this video will get boosted up in the algorithm so new viewers can watch it as well. That would also give me the encouragement and the heads up to make more videos like this on infamous events in Hollywood history along with my reactions. To be frank, I actually have over 100 video ideas like this one, and I have them cooking in the background. So if you would like to get some additional information like behind the scenes footage and updates on this series, please consider supporting me on Patreon. My Patreon is like the best way to support my channel because even with like copyright claims on videos like this and with algorithmic changes, your support on Patreon is what keeps this channel going. So thank you so much. I hope you enjoyed this very interesting and detailed video on this topic. Let me know if there are any topics you'd like me to discuss. Thank you so much for watching, and I hope I didn't waste your time. See you next video.